Welcome to the Asshole Book Club. Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 of Catwoman Soul Stealer. Last chapter was just kind of a catch-up with Selena, find out where she's been for the last 2 years, and just getting into her head a little bit, seeing how she thinks about things now. And I believe this chapter is where we get introduced to Luke Fox, who is a character in a show that I just started watching called Batwoman. Pretty good. Not bad. Anyway, I will get started with the chapter. Oh, why is my eye hurting? Sorry about that. Alright, Chapter 4. The nightmare was always the same. Blinding heat. Blinding sun. Heat so dry it choked the air out of his lungs, and a flat plain of sand and scrub spreading in the horizon. And then the roar, the screaming, the exploding sand and metal, the blood and chaos, gunfire. A world away, a different world, different life, different hell. Because for Luke Fox, hell wasn't fire and brimstone. It was friends he'd laughed with in the summer at the canteen winding up in body bags by lunch. Night after night, this dream, this moment. A year had passed since he'd returned to Gotham City, and Luke was still crawling back toward who he'd been before. Whoever that person was, whoever had been ripped apart that day, along with the flesh of his ribs, where the Kevlar hadn't been covering him, as if the enemy they'd been dispatched to put down had known precisely where to strike with the IED. That went off beneath the tank lumbering ahead, sending shrapnel tearing through the air, through him and his soldiers. Had it been worth it? The grueling training and the 3 years in the Marine Corps, had they made a difference? They were the questions he asked himself over and over, that haunted every step, every breath, the questions that drove him each night into the streets of Gotham City. Luke blew out a breath, his muscled chest rising and falling as moonlight leaked in through the windows, highlighting the jagged line along his ribs, the scars stark against his brown skin. He scanned the sky, his penthouse apartment offering an unobstructed view of downtown Gotham City. No bat-shaped sigil lighting up the night. Luke couldn't decide if he was disappointed or not. He glanced at the clock beside his bed. Only 2 hours ago, he'd crept back into his apartment after a quiet night of patrolling. Apparently, the August heat had made even the worst of Gotham City decide to stay indoors. Luke snorted, imagining some of the usual suspects opting to seek out an air-conditioned movie theater instead of terrorizing the streets. At least he still had his sense of humor, sort of. Bruce Wayne didn't have one, or hadn't revealed one in the months Luke had been training with him. It had been his dad's idea, right after the family's annual 4th of July fireworks barbecue at the beach house last summer, after the incident. Luke had been standing among the crowd gathered on the back lawn, beer in hand, when the fireworks had exploded over their private beach. As they'd done every summer that he could remember. But unlike all those summers before, as those initial fireworks bloomed and boomed in the dark sky, his body had gone absolutely haywire, as if it had been programmed like one of his gadgets. He'd been unable to get his breath down, to control the undiluted terror that swept through him, pushed in on him as if the ground were about to swallow him up, as if he were again in that blood-soaked desert, and his nightmare was playing out all over again. His first full-blown panic attack. in the middle of his family's annual party. Bruce had been standing next to him when it happened, and had instantly noticed the symptoms and gotten Luke's father to help discreetly escort his son back into the house. When he'd finally been able to breathe, when the world had crept back in and the desert had faded away once more, it had all come spilling out. He hadn't been able to save them, his team. He told them he had no idea if he'd made a difference that day or any day in his life. His father and Bruce had sat with him just listening, like they had nowhere else to be. The subsequent diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered that particular night by the crackle and boom of the fireworks, by the flashing lights. And then the treatment, group therapy once a week and private sessions every 3 days. That was fine. That was good. Necessary. Vital. But his dad's suggested treatment had been just between him and Bruce and Luke. A visit to Wayne Manor a week later, to a secret chamber beneath it. If Luke wanted to make a difference, Bruce had said, perhaps there was something he could do about it. Luke had learned a lot in the 13 months since, about himself, about what haunted him, and about the man who lived in Wayne Manor. Giving up on sleep, Luke swung his legs out of bed and padded onto the balcony. Even at 4 a.m, the air hung hot and sticky against his skin. He again scanned the city, listening for sirens, anything to call him out of bed, out of his penthouse apartment, anything to do in these final few hours before dawn, when he knew sleep would no longer come. Nothing, only muggy heat and silence. Even the stars seemed small and faded. The constellations he recognized, as well as family members, blurred under the blankets of heat. Their names rattled through his head, more instinct than intentional thought. Lyra, Sagittarius, Hercules. Luke rubbed a hand over his short hair. He'd let the sides grow in a bit, but kept it military short. Movement to his left caught his eye. Every sense went on alert as his body slipped into a loose fighting stance. Being 30 floors up wouldn't keep the more creative criminals from finding their way here to loot the troves of one of Gotham City's richest. A flash of gold at the corner of his balcony. No, not his balcony, but the edge of the balcony for the penthouse that shared this top floor. The corner of which was just barely visible from where he stood, along with the source of that gold-long blonde hair, slightly curled at the ends. There were only 2 apartments up here. The other had been sitting empty for months, until yesterday, he remembered. The apartment had been leased by some socialite. Old money, the gossip site said when he checked them in the morning for any hint of trouble ahead. Holly Vanderhees. Luke peered over the rail, craning his neck to see more of the owner of that luxurious blonde hair he could barely just make out. A neighbor was an inconvenience. He should have bought the apartment next door just to keep it empty. A stupid mistake. A rookie mistake. He'd have to be careful now, coming in and out of the apartment. Might have to account for his odd hours if she was a snoop, especially if she was a gossip. Most socialites were. He'd developed a healthy respect for them. He'd seen socialites take each other down with words and rumors far more efficiently than insurgents had with bullets and IEDs. His new neighbor vanished along the wraparound balcony, as if she'd been pacing it. First night in a new city, perhaps she hadn't been able to sleep either. For a heartbeat, he debated crossing the small hallway they shared and knocking on her door, introducing himself. But he couldn't afford another mistake. Building bonds invited questions, and if Holly Vanderhees had no idea who she was living next to, if she never saw or heard from him, so much the better. Easier to be unaccounted for. He didn't know how Bruce did it. juggling the man the world believed they knew with the vigilante who fought to keep Gotham City safe. Luke had asked him throughout their training, but Bruce hadn't been forthcoming. It was one of the few things Bruce hadn't taught him. Luke had known plenty about fighting, about building clever, useful things before they'd begun. Even before enlisting in the Marines, he'd been keen on honing his body as he was on sharpening his mind. A rare combination, his mom often said, beaming at him. Brains and beauty. Luke always laughed at her, waving it off. Even if the brains part was officially true, he'd been declared a genius before finishing high school. A lot of good that had done him overseas. He certainly wasn't doing much with it these days as the millionaire playboy the world believed him to be. Son of Lucius Fox, the CEO of Wayne Industries. Granted a cushy job in applied science at the company. What the job actually did was allow Luke to roll into Wayne Tower, go down to the restricted sub-level 7, and mess around with his suit, his gear, his various gadgets that helped him round up Gotham City's worst. Luke sometimes even modified Bruce's gear since his colleague was always game for a new upgrade. They'd bonded over it, their interest in tech. Watery gray light began to bleed into the eastern horizon. He had another boxing match tonight. He'd make sure not to mention it to his mother at brunch in a few hours. You shave years off my life with every match, she complained to him and his dad. It's only semi-professional, his dad often said, coming to his defense. Knowing that the boxing, which Luke had done for years before he slipped out, had always steadied him, settled his mind, and in the years since he'd returned, he'd picked it up again, as part of his ongoing, endless recovery. Only semi-pro, as his dad said, as was befitting a socialite of Gotham City, even if he didn't lose, ever. Not a single fight. What his mom didn't know, what she couldn't know, despite how much he wanted to tell her, was that he and his dad had decided the fights would not only balance him, but help explain away any injuries that might arise during his nocturnal activities, his real job. Batwing. He'd come up with the name himself, in part to honor the training he'd done with Bruce, but mostly as a nod to his favorite part of the suit, the part he'd worked the hardest on and got one hell of a kick out of surprising lowlives with. Nothing like a pair of retractable wings capable of gliding over long distances to make criminals wet themselves. And to land easily on the roof before slipping back inside the building. A task that would now be indefinitely harder with his new neighbor. Luke frowned towards Holly's balcony before turning back inside and sealing the door shut. The AC instantly icy against his skin. He'd figure out some way to make sure she thought he was as boring as possible. Luke headed into his closet, lights flickering on automatically. He glanced to the wood panel that held a full-length mirror. A hidden touchpad would reveal the extra closet concealed behind it, chock full of various mechanized suits, weapons, and gear. But he opted for gym shorts and an old Marine tee, sliding on his worn sneakers before striding out of the room. A full-service gym was open 24/7, a level below. It'd be empty at this time of the day, whatever 4:30 a.m. was classified as. Luke caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror as he left. His skin was still shiny with sweat, his cheeks a bit hollowed out. His mom would worry at brunch. She was too damn smart not to know everything, especially if he didn't get rid of the empty, glazed look in his eyes. A year and it was still there. A year of trying to adjust to civilian life, managing his PTSD so that he could finally do something of value to keep this city from falling into ruin. To honor the good men and women who hadn't returned home. at least not outside of a pine box, and the families they'd left behind. Luke shouldered his way through the gym door, the fluorescent lights a clang to his senses. All the TV screens above the machines set to various news channels, even they were full of nothing, filler stories because the truth of the world, they didn't sell ad space. And Americans watching didn't really want to have their oversized houses and wasteful lifestyles called into question when faced with the poverty most of the planet lived in, the despair, the ugliness of it. Hell, they couldn't even stand to look too long at the East End in their own damn city. His mom knew that, fought against it every day. He supposed his mom's ball gowns and well-tailored suits were another kind of armor, that she too had masks she used to fight against the injustices of the world, especially as a black woman in the upper echelon of society. He wished he could tell her that, wished he could explain that he was honored to follow in her footsteps, even if the fighting they did each night was different. Hers took place at galas and in the boardrooms, winning over Gotham City's richest to contribute to their charities. With that charm and wit of hers, his fights, beyond those in the ring, were in places few dared to venture. Luke picked a treadmill that enabled him to see anyone who entered the gym. Another lesson from Bruce, always be on guard, and climbed on. Punching in his preferred speed and incline, his body was a tool, a weapon, the same as any he'd fought with overseas. And even as Luke launched into a run, even as sweat again slid down his body and his lungs burned in his broad chest, he still couldn't feel it himself. As if his skin, his bones, were as distant as the high-tech suit he donned every night. The sun began to rise over Gotham City, the wall of windows offering an unparalleled view of the city skyline. Another day. He'd make it count. For the friends who hadn't made it home. For the people living in this city, he'd make it count. Well. This Luke Fox is a lot different than the one in Batwoman. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you feel like it, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what you're thinking about the book so far. Have a great day, everyone, and I will see you later.